This week, I'm finally putting an idea I've had into action, creating a sort of sculptural vessel, not an ashtray, that's made up of steps on the inside and is left quite thickly potted. I want these to be heavy so that they can be used as paperweights or bookends, or for simply looking at and displaying in your house. And I've thought about how to make these in two ways. The first idea was to throw two separate components, which I'd trim and then score and slip together and then pierce a hole in the bottom so the shape doesn't distort as it dries, compressing the air inside it. But the idea of throwing that stepped shape and then trimming it is rather daunting. Not only that, but when you're joining two bits of clay together, the likelihood of a crack forming between them is always greater. So instead I think I'm going to do something rather unconventional and throw a solid block of clay, wait for it to turn leather hard, and then I'll turn the steps in. And then I'll figure out a way of removing much of the weight from the underside. So, to start, I'm going to begin with a simple block of clay, which I'll already pat into a shape that resembles the block I intend to throw. And I'll round its base, this way when I throw it against the wheel, it doesn't trap air underneath it. I'll also be working on a bat. This way, once the simple shape has been thrown, I can simply lift the round of wood away, carrying the block of clay with it, which means I don't have to handle and potentially distort what I've thrown. I attach the piece of MDF to a clay bat, which is leather hard, and I use a bit of slip like glue smeared onto it to help it stick. I do the same on the top, dampening a patch so the stoneware sticks to it. My initial fault was using relatively hard clay, which for a shape like this really isn't helpful, although perhaps it does mean that the clay will turn to leather hard quicker as compared to if it was thrown with really soft stuff. This meant that the lump of clay needed to be coned up and down once or twice, as I could feel some irregularities in it. In many ways, working like this, from a single thick block of clay, is far more similar to how a woodworker or metalworker turns on a lathe, a process that's entirely subtractive, as unlike ceramics, you can't easily add metal or wood back to the original block, although by using this method, there are some shapes that I think will be easier to make. I'm sure, if you really practiced and made a lot of these, it would be a faster process to throw the two separate components, join them together, and then pierce the hole, like I showed at the start. But it's also just far more simple doing it this way. The thick round of clay is thrown, it's then scraped into shape, and I even blasted it with a heat gun just to take the edge off. This is then left for a couple of days until it feels really leather hard, as inevitably the material inside is going to be softer than the clay on the outside. The block itself can then be trimmed and shaped, and that's it. As long as the walls are relatively consistent all the way through, it should dry without cracking. But after going through this process, if you aren't a potter who enjoys trimming, I wouldn't recommend doing it this way, as it is rather tedious. In the future, this would be a shape to make on a lathe, as with the block of clay on its side, all the material that's trimmed away just falls out onto the floor, but because this sits upright, all the material that's excised simply collects in on itself, on the steps and in the hollow. And as you're constantly revealing newer and softer clay on the inside of the block, it gets stickier and stickier. So you sort of have to dry the piece as you go, which I occasionally did by just hitting it with the heat gun, or in most cases, I just dealt with it. These next two clips are from the second and third day of the block drying, and at this point, on the fourth day, it no longer felt damp and soft. I think it's ready, although as this is my first time creating these, I've thrown 4 blanks, I should mention. I'm certainly going to learn a lot over the next hour or two on the wheel. The first thing I'm doing, as I want this side to be the base, is trimming it flat. This way it can be flipped upside down and sit level, as previously it would have rocked a tiny bit from side to side. I brush some slip onto the wheel head, and then the lump of clay is positioned down and tap-centered. The slip very quickly dries and fuses the clay firmly against the wheel, and at this point I'm looking for the walls to be centered, not so much the top, as there is some wavering motion in it, but I'll easily be able to turn away any irregularity as there's just so much excess clay to work with. And with the walls and top level, I can begin hollowing out the piece of clay. And there really isn't much to it. I simply remove material, layer by layer, starting in the center and working my way out to the first step. And as there is so much material to get through, I can work quite roughly and quickly until I get to that exact spot where I want the step to be. Which in this case was just about here. I want these vessels to have a thick, sturdy rim that's very blocky and has sharp right angles, as ultimately, with all the steps and all the angularity on these shapes, there's going to be a lot of sharp edges for the glazes to interact interestingly over. The glass should pool on the steps and in the hollow in the very centre, but typically the glazes I use when they coat a very sharp edge break over them. This doesn't mean they literally break. Instead, it's a term that potters use to describe how glaze reacts over a sharp lip of clay beneath it. The glass can't adhere in a thick layer on these points, and instead it thins out drastically, often changing the colour of the glaze. For instance, a Timecodes glaze can be black where it's thick, but where it breaks over a sharp edge, it can be orange or red. And that's exactly what I hope happens with this pot, and whilst once trimmed it may seem very crisp and sharp, much of this will be softened by the glaze that eventually coats it, thus changing its overall appearance quite dramatically. There's a tremendous amount of back and forth when making these. Often the clay that comes off marks the regions above it, and I think in hindsight the best way to go about it would be to trim all the steps very roughly, then let the entire piece dry out for another day or so before doing all the very detailed finishing work. That's what I'd definitely do if I was making these en masse. This way the surfaces of clay and those sharp edges would have more strength and they'd be less likely to be distorted as ribbons of clay crash into them. But as this is just a one-off piece, I'm dealing with it. It's steel turning tools which are the hero of this process, not my usual tungsten carbide blades, as they'd struggle not only with the angle of turning, but they'd also struggle to slice away clay neatly. As they are so sharp, all it takes is one mistake for the entire vessel to be ruined. Like a hot knife through butter, the tungsten blades would just catch and rip through an entire, carefully trimmed step. So I much prefer using these steel blades in this case. They also leave a much more burnished, smooth surface. And please ignore, or perhaps enjoy, the jazzy guitar and saxophone you might hear in the background. On Thursday afternoons, my neighbour and his friend always spend a few hours practicing, which is lovely for me most of the time, but typically I try to avoid filming, as it just adds something else I need to think about when editing these videos together. With all the steps now trimmed, I'm going to work on making sure that all the flat planes are smooth and even and aren't covered in too many marks left by the turning tools. And with the inside finished, it's time to flip the vessel over and tackle the back, which I think is going to be a far more irritating process, as it's bound to be more difficult to remove the clay that's trimmed away. I use a plastic kidney to scrape away any excess left on the wheelhead. This way it doesn't embed itself into the top portion of the pot I so carefully finished. Now, on the bottom, I'm essentially going to try and remove as much clay as I can without interfering with the internal shape. Whilst, at the same time, I want it to of course look aesthetically pleasing, as of course I don't want somebody to pick this up, turn it upside down and be shocked by a messy, unconsidered level of finish. And I thought in this instance, unlike the other three I've trimmed, I'll turn this portion to have a curved surface, to contrast the sharp, angular shape on the other side. I made a mistake on one of the four I made by turning the very middle too thin, ending up with a piece that has a hole in it, so I'm being somewhat cautious about removing too much from that part. I think it's time I secured this in place with some soft clay. As I was trimming, I was constantly taking this off the wheel, feeling the cross section and putting it back down, as it's really quite difficult to envisage where the steps are from this side and then how to trim accordingly. And instead of risking it or perhaps leaving the vessel too thick, it's better just to remove the pot for a second, to feel the cross section and then to place it back down and continue working. It was in that groove at the very bottom where all the clay got stuck, but it's still not quite neat enough for my liking. And I suppose another question is, do I glaze the underside of these pots, or do I leave the clay bare and raw? I haven't quite made my mind up yet. I suppose this portion, where I stamp it with my maker's mark, could be unglazed. This way, if there is any movement and this area sinks, it doesn't stick and fuse to the kiln shelf. The last thing I do is just burnish the top edge one more time, as it had become quite scuffed in places from scraping across the wheel head. And at this point I place all the vessels on a plastic lime board, and I'll let these dry very slowly, wrapped up for as long as it takes, really, for these to dry out very slowly and evenly. Here are the same pieces a week or so later, and I'll show you each one, their fronts and backs, just to give you a better idea of the forms I've been making, starting with the piece I've thrown and trimmed in this video. Whilst I said these were heavy at the start, I think describing them as balanced is a better way of doing it. They are weighty, but they don't feel really heavy. The weight itself feels like it's distributed evenly throughout the vessel, rather than all being focused in one spot, which makes it intentional. Next, there's a slightly taller version with many more steps, and this version also has a stepped underside. So please, if you are watching, let me know which version you prefer, the stepped foot or the curved foot. I think this might be my favourite of the four. I suppose what I'm trying to do is distance them from looking anything like ashtrays or candlestick holders, but that is quite a challenge. Here's the simple version I accidentally turned a hole through. I ended up tidying it and made it look intentional. In a way, this makes it more sculptural, as with a hole, it's less functional, but we'll see. I suppose at the end of the day, these four were tests. Smaller, mock-ups. For some larger versions I'd like to create, but these smaller ones are sweet, too. But strangely enough, when put all together, I think I like them less. Instead, I prefer the idea of displaying these alongside many more functional vessels. These are small, sculptural, architectural pots, which, for that reason, hopefully stand out, instead of there being a pile of these on a plinth or a table, for instance. Anyway, I'll make another video in the near future showing how these are glazed and fired, so I apologise for the tease, but it'll be worth it, I hope. Thank you so much for taking your time to watch. Do let me know what you think of these, and, as always, I'll see you next time.